I am Mike Lyons, your host for another oral history interview for the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. The association's purpose is to preserve the rich history and contributions of the area's radio, television, and broadcasting industries. The association is open to those past and present broadcasters and those affiliated with the region's broadcasting industry and entities who have served this region's proud broadcasting heritage. We welcome students who are focusing their careers on the broadcasting industry. Today is September 24, 2021, the day we're taping this interview. Our guest today is former radio broadcaster Mike Miller. He spent 7 years on the air at WOKV here in Jacksonville. He had a 30-year career in broadcasting. Mike, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, let's just start out and go back to your high school days while you were playing in the rock band. Did you have any idea that you wanted to be a radio broadcaster?
You know, I always liked the idea of performing in one way or another, and I don't quite know why. My father always used to say, someday, Mike, you're going to take over for Johnny Carson. Yeah, right. Anyhow, he always saw me in that light as well for some reason, and I actually started with my band when I was 13, so I was pretty young at the time, as were all of the band members. I don't think anyone was over 15. But that was kind of my first taste into it. And then as I decided what I wanted to do going forward, I knew I didn't have the talent to go as a musician for a living. So to me, the next best thing was to get into radio broadcasting. And so that's what I did.
Your home is Gary, Indiana.
College.
You went to college in Chicago. Tell me about that.
Well, I actually started at Indiana University, and that's really where I got my first radio job through a friend of mine that I went to high school with in Hammond, Indiana. And there was a carrier current radio station. For those who aren't familiar with carrier current, now this goes back to 1966. It's one that goes through telephone lines rather than over-the-air broadcasting. And it was only broadcast through 4 dormitories that were on the Indiana University campus. So I had started by doing a shift on that, enjoyed it, took on another shift, and decided that that was really the direction I wanted to go. That's when I transferred to Columbia in Chicago and majored in communications and started my professional radio career at that point.
Mm-hmm. How was that major? Was that a good experience there?
You know, it was excellent there. Even though, you know, Columbia College was not a big Ivy League school like Indiana University was, most of the instructors were people that were in the industries that they were teaching from. So I had people that were working at WGN, which was the #1 independent radio television station rather in the country. Also from WMAQ, which was NBC, WLS, which was ABC, and CBS as well. They were all people that were working at those different stations at different capacities, and then transferring those abilities into the classroom. So that's really where I got my instruction, was much more so from professionals than from academics.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a broadcasting job while you were in college, like you did
Yes.
at Indiana?
Yes, I did. I was commuting actually from my Indiana home to Chicago every day for school, and then came back and had a nighttime show, a very small FM radio station at the time. And that was really the only non-talk radio I ever did. It was a program called An Evening on the South Shore, which was the South Shore of Lake Michigan. And it was playing things like Percy Faith and Montavani and you know, people of that ilk, artists from that ilk, and I was there just acting as the smooth-voiced announcer who was announcing the different songs and playing the commercials and the PSAs and things like that. So I did that during my last year, and then I went and got a job in Gary, Indiana, where my first real professional job, I feel, in Gary, Indiana, when I left, well, actually, while I was still going to college to some degree. I started there in 1968.
That was your hometown. How did that come about? How did you end up going back home and getting that job?
I had known a couple of the DJs that were there through dances and things like that they used to have in the region. And I got to know them, and I always asked them, I said, if anything ever opens up at the radio station, please let me know. And I mean, the first job I had, which was a non-paying job to get my foot in the door, was just basically putting records back into the rack and helping out more in that kind of a capacity rather than on air. Then the program director, against his better judgment, decided to give me a couple-hour show on the weekend, and that's really when I started honing my skills.
Was that a talk show? Was that a talk show?
It turned into a talk show. It wasn't initially. It was still music, even though my voice wasn't on. I was just playing music. But then I can't recall how I landed this, but I landed the morning show.
Speak by myself for the next hour or two or three or four, then you're going to have to fill in the blanks, all right? Speaking of that, hello?
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 When's the last day?
When's the last day?
Yes.
For what?
The big goodbye.
The big goodbye? There will be no big goodbyes.
On WLTH in Gary, Indiana, and that was in 1969. And I started a morning show, and there was a very conservative, very controversial newsman who also happened to be the general manager of the station, who was doing the news while I was doing my program. And he would come out with these outlandish things to say. Now, you got to realize Gary, Indiana is a steel town, very much like Pittsburgh was. So it was very blue collar, very, very democratic, very democratic. And to have a conservative talk show host putting out his editorials in the morning, I just started to answer his editorials on the air and saying, Warren, you don't know what you're talking about. And I would come on and give an alternative view. And before you know it, the music started going away, and he and I just started to do this banter back and forth. We really turned out to be excellent friends. It had to be. He was the general manager.
Right, but saying you questioning the general manager in your first job like that on air, that's maybe not so smart.
Well, we did have an understanding, and he liked it because it fed into him and allowed him to finally have some conversation with someone other than people in the Ethernet over the air. So anyhow, that started that, and that's really where I started developing, I guess, the skills of being able to debate, number one, and to expand my speech talents and skills, so that it worked myself into more of a talk show host.
And that's pretty much what you did for 30 years in broadcasting, was a talk show host on radio for the most part.
Exactly.
Now, you went on to Orlando from Gary, Indiana. How did that happen? How did you get to Orlando?
There was a friend of mine that I had gone to school with who, by the way, was also in my teenage band. He was the keyboard and singer, one of the singers. And he had gotten a job down at Disney when they first opened in 1971. I had heard of a production director job at WDBO in Orlando. And I called him up and I said, hey, how would you like to have a guest for a week? I want to come down, and if I can get an interview with this radio station, I want to do that. So he was very happy to have me come down. I did. I stayed. I had an interview with the program director at the time, as well as the general manager. Wonderful guy, one of my favorite people in the entire world. His name was Carl Holberg, rest his soul. He was just great. And I didn't get the production job. I really wasn't good enough to be able to get it, to be honest with you. But he called me up anyhow, and he said, listen, Mike, I'm in a bind. I've got a guy that's been doing nighttime talk radio here at the station, and he's leaving us. Do you know anybody in your area that might be able to fill that void? And I ended up saying, well, let me see what I can do. And then I started sending him some tapes of the morning show that I was doing in Gary, so that he would get a sense of the kind of talk that I was doing and what my knowledge and skills were in current events and things of that sort. And I sent it to him. And he called me back and said, why didn't you tell me you did talk radio? I said, because I was interviewing for a production job. And at that point, he said, when can you get here? So I gave my notice at Gary, Indiana, left that station, went to Orlando, and started a nighttime talk show. That was in 1972.
You had to feel pretty good that you were going to a big market like Orlando, just basically 3 years into your career or less?
Not just that, also it was the most exciting time Orlando ever had in its history, because Disney had opened just 8 months prior to me getting there.
Wow.
So it was, everything was fresh and spanking new and everything else. And because WDBO was the #1 AM station in the market, now remember, 1972, so there still aren't a lot of FM stations around. AM was still the king of radio. So we developed an excellent relationship with Disney, and I became very close with a lot of the people that worked there. And I did some work out there myself, pardon me, at Disney, and we remained friends for many, many years. I used to go back for openings for different hotels that they would have or theme parks that they had, and the rest of it. And it was just a great relationship. I really, really liked my years in Orlando. It was a great place to be at that time. There were still orange groves, which was kind of interesting.
So
now it's all asphalt.
Yeah, you were entrenched as a radio talk show host, and you really liked it. That's really what you wanted to do, is to be a talk show host.
Yeah, it really was. That ended up being my everything. That was my life, to be honest with you. It really was.
And you did some television. You got into television in Orlando also,
yeah.
Did you not?
WDBO had a TV station as well as a radio station, and because the nighttime program did very, very well, the TV station asked me if I would come over and do a talk show on TV, a live talk show on TV on Friday nights at midnight. What happened was my show ended at midnight on WDBO, but we got somebody to come in to do the last hour so that I could run over to the TV station and get ready for the live program that went on at midnight. So I did that for about a year, and worked out real well, real well.
How was TV different from radio? Was radio still easier for you since you had done that, or did you find TV very interesting as well?
Well, I liked the idea of broadening my skill sets. That was great. The experience was terrific, but there's no doubt about it. Radio was my number one love. You have a lot more freedom on radio than obviously you do on TV. Even though the TV show was not scripted at all, except for intros and outros, which they put up on teleprompter. But the rest of that, it was just me interviewing people. And we even took calls on the air, which was kind of interesting. The setup that they had, because we had to have a 7-second delay on TV, just as we did on radio. And the way they did it through TV, and this is really kind of fascinating if you can envision it. They had 2 video machines, and they separated them by 7 seconds. So they had the tape of my recorded show on tape recorder 1, video tape recorder 1, and it went down the loop for 7 seconds and played back on video player 2.
And went out over the air.
So, and then would go out over the air. We all cringed at the idea of having to cut something off because we had no idea how we were going to be able to do that. Right. It was going to be really very difficult.
The radio show you did in Orlando, how would you describe how it went? Was it a series of guests that you booked guests, or that you scheduled people to call in or appear with you? How did that work?
Both. We had guests, always in studio. I had some of them on the phone when I couldn't have them in person. But phone calls were really was an audience-driven program. The phone calls that came into the show, both for the guests and when I did open line segments, is really what I really, really enjoyed. Yeah. And I got to meet a lot of people because people were coming down to Orlando all the time. Because of Disney, of course. Now remember, SeaWorld hadn't opened up. There was no Legoland. There was no other report. There was only a Magic Kingdom and 2 hotels. That's what Disney was when it first opened. The Contemporary, the Polynesian, and the Magic Kingdom. And you had the monorail that just made this circle that went back from, the park to the 2 hotels. And that's all there really was for the first year. But we had so many people come down. And as they opened up more parks, they would have all these big celebrations, and celebrities would come down, and I would grab them and have them on my program. Mm-hmm. So I really got to meet a lot of people I never would have met in my lifetime if it hadn't been for that.
So you had to develop your skills. You got to talk to a lot of different people, and you took phone calls. You really had to be good at winging it, didn't you?
Yeah, you really did. Because you never really knew what to expect. I obviously tried to study guests before they came on the air to some degree, but I kind of took a bit of a lesson from Larry King. I don't know if people are aware of this. Larry King once said that he had never read a book of any author who ever appeared on his show, because he wanted to ask questions that the typical non-reader would ask that author about the subject matter that they spoke or that they wrote about. Now, I didn't quite go to that extent. Larry was a lot better and much more talented than I was in that regard. But I understood where he was coming from and tried to do my best to ask questions that I knew the audience would want asked. And those people in the audience had not read the book that we were talking about when it was an author.
So you were in Orlando, and you went to a lot of different cities, big markets, before you got to Jacksonville. Let's go through some of those real quick and how you got there. You went from Orlando to Hartford. How'd you end up in Hartford, Connecticut? I maybe would have stayed in Florida, but how'd you go to Hartford?
Well, this was, again, that brass ring that I kept driving at. I always wanted to get into the top 5 markets. Actually, my secret dream was to get back to Chicago, which was my hometown. And get on radio in Chicago on WLS or WCFL or WIND or WGN or one of the big stations in Chicago. So I was always trying to find a way to get on that ladder to move me more towards that. There was a guy named Mike Joseph who was a radio headhunter, and he was working for a radio station in Cocoa Beach. And he had heard my show when he was in Cocoa Beach, and then he got commission to help with this station WTIC in Hartford. And when they were putting their lineup together, the lineup that they wanted, Mike had said, I think I've got somebody in Florida that you guys may want to listen to. He's very good. So he called me up and he said, how would you feel about talking to some people in Hartford, Connecticut? So I said, well, I'll talk to anybody. So I went up there, talked to him. We hit it off very, very well. And it was a very tough leave to leave Orlando. Another side of that is my girlfriend, who turned out to be my wife, was a newswoman on WLOF radio, and she was on the air there, and I was on WDVO, and we dated for a couple of years, and she and I talked quite a bit. And I said, listen, there's this opportunity. I don't want to leave you, but I really think I need to do this. And she ended up saying, well, they're going to be changing format at WLOF, and I'm not sure that the news department is going to be as strong as it is right now. She said, would you like to hook up? So she ended up moving up to Hartford with me. And she got a job at a small radio station in New Britain while I was on the air in Hartford.
Interesting story on how you ended up to go from Hartford to Detroit. Now, that's a big market.
That now was a big market. That's all of a sudden, and that was because that was 1980. The Republican National Convention was in Detroit, which I always thought was really interesting. One of the capitals of the Democratic Party, Detroit, Michigan, the home of car building, and here they were having the Republican convention there. But nevertheless, they did. And my boss said, listen, Mike, we want you to go to Detroit and do your shows from the convention. You'll be tagging along with the Connecticut delegation. Sorry about all that, folks. I'm getting my notices on my phone if you're hearing that. So I went with the Connecticut delegation, one of whom was Prescott Bush, who was a brother of Herbert Walker Bush. And he was part of our delegation. And there were a number of other people who were Republican higher-ups who went Lowell Weicker and people like that. So I kind of hung out with them, did my show, had them on my program to talk about, the news of the convention for the day, and then was able to bring other guests on from the Republican Party to be my guest. And I was there for 5 days. Well, while I was there, I was broadcasting out of the studios of WXYZ, ABC-owned station in Detroit. They had a trailer set up there and they had an extra studio, so they allowed me to use that. And their program director was listening to my show when I was on at night. And right before I left, a day before I left, they asked me if I wanted to go out and have dinner and have a conversation. And then they offered me a position at WXYZ. So I ended up having a great contract with them, went back to Hartford, told them about what had happened. They said, we don't blame you at all. It's a great opportunity for you. Just don't forget us, which I didn't. And I went to Detroit to work at ABC.
Right. Well, I didn't hear you on the radio, but you had to do a great job because headhunters are picking you. Detroit's hearing you in Detroit, and you go there, and that had to make you feel really good.
It was great, really gratifying. And I think the most gratifying part of all of it was my father, who's long since passed, but nevertheless, my dad followed my career like crazy. I have scrapbooks of things that he had put together while I was at different radio stations, different news articles and promotional pieces and things of that sort. And that was really his way of showing his love and his pride of the work that I had been doing, which was great.
For the sake of time, you went to Boston.
Yep.
That was a big market.
Boston.
Then you went to Miami. Then you went to West Palm. And then you ended up in Jacksonville. How did you end up leaving West Palm and come here to Jacksonville in 1993, I believe it was?
That's correct. There was, they decided, I was doing a nighttime show again in West Palm Beach, and for finances, they decided that they were going to go syndication at night to save the salary, my producer's salary, my board tech salary. I mean, there were a lot of salaries that were part of the nighttime show. So it was a financial move on their part, really. So when they said that they were going to make that move, lo and behold, here comes Mike Joseph again, that same headhunter who found me for Hartford, found me for West Palm Beach, and asked me if I would come up there. And I, at the time, talked to my wife and said, listen, I'm not sure where else we want to go after West Palm Beach, but I don't think there are many markets in Florida that are left. So, I think we ought to take this job in Jacksonville. So I did. And that's how I came up here.
And you came here to Jacksonville, OKV. What was it like working at OKV and working in Jacksonville, Florida?
It was it was so different from anything that I had ever worked at. Miami, West Palm Beach is kind of very similar to Miami. Very democratic, very ethnically, diverse. And Jacksonville in 1993, as you know, was still probably trying to feel its way as far as what it wanted to do when it grew up. It's very Republican. There really wasn't a lot going on until the Jaguar announcement in '94.
That was a year after you got here.
That was a year
so
after
you're in the middle of another big thing.
Yeah, and in fact, WOKV was the radio station of the Jaguars. So when the Jaguars went on the air, I, who was doing the morning show at the time, along with a co-host from the morning show at our FM affiliate, WRMF, ended up doing a countdown to kickoff show for the Jaguars for 2 years, for their first 2 years, which really was very, very exciting. Man. Because it was at the beginning of the franchise, got to meet the players, got to meet the Weavers, and all of the other principals who were all part of the Jaguars, and that was a lot of fun.
Your timing is great. Disney in Orlando and the Jags in Jacksonville. That's pretty solid, isn't it?
Not too bad. And I'll tell you, in Detroit, by the way, you may remember they had a USFL football team, which also came on board while I was broadcasting at WXYZ. And that was fun. We didn't carry the Lions, but we did carry that team, the USFL team. Only lasted a couple of years, and I was gone by the time they disbanded. But that was kind of neat. Right. Because you're on the ground floor of that.
You left OKV after 7 years. There was a format change.
Yes.
Sales of stations and format changes affected your job at several of these places that you were at. That had to be a tough thing to deal with in radio.
It's part of the job. I mean, it's part of the industry. I wasn't the only one. I remember when there was an announcement that went out in the paper that I was leaving my job in West Palm Beach. And I can't tell you how many people in the industry wrote me and said, hey, Mike, you're not alone, man. I was fired from 3 jobs. Rush Limbaugh said he was fired from California before he got his job in Kansas City. So, I mean, it's just part of the history,
How about the morning? There's other times for you, another thing. In other words, you don't want to pursue it?
This is not my decision, Bernie, and I don't want to make it
Don't they have to give you a reason?
No.
I'll tell you frankly, you're as easy and good to listen to as that certain fat talk host who's always bragging about his figures. Frankly, I can't understand it. No, I'm serious, Mike.
I know. Well, because people like cheap talk, so they listen a lot to that.
In other words, they're hooked on shock.
Yeah. That's the new phase. It's it's the hula hoop of 1987.
Very few people, I should say, are Tom Wills, who last that long in any one market, or George Winterland.
Right. What would you say to students that want to get into radio and would like to be in radio and a radio talk show host? What would you say to them?
The industry has changed so terribly much. I'm not sure I would even recognize it if I went into it again full time. But it is the most frustrating, aggravating, and wonderful job anybody could ever have. You just have to roll with it. You've got to roll with the good times, and you can't get disillusioned by those times that turn sour, like when a format has changed or an ownership has changed at a station that you might be working for. But the first thing I would advise any student wanting to get into it is do what I did. Get your foot in the door to do anything, and don't worry about getting money. You're looking for, at this point, experience and to develop your skills. So I don't care if somebody hires you to sweep floors. Do it if you can get yourself into that media house that you want to work in. And then just work your way up. Be good at it. Be a good soldier.
You went into government here in the city. You worked for the government for a lot, for the mayors and chief of staffs of different organizations. What was that like? That changed for you. You were JTA. You did media PR for them, and then other jobs with them. What was that like? You were doing that for about how long? 20 years
3
or
years.
so? Or?
Well, I was with the city for 3 years. I went over to the mayor's office, Delaney's office, in 2000. And stayed with him until we left office. Let me go back. When I first started with the city, I worked for the Economic Development Commission of Mike Weinstein. Then the Super Bowl came, and I was working on the Super Bowl with Mike. Mike then left the JEDC to work full-time on the Super Bowl, and Audrey Moran came in to oversee the JEDC while Mike was doing the Super Bowl. Then Audrey, who I became very close with at the time, went over to the mayor's office when Susie Wiles left being chief of staff. So she told John Delaney, I'll be happy to come over, but I'm bringing somebody with me. Is that okay? And she brought me with her. He said that's perfect because they had an opening for city council liaison. And he said Mike could do that role because he already knows all the city council members from his radio show. So I went over in that capacity. And worked actually for Audrey more than anybody else in lobbying the city council for the mayor and getting his programs across.
Right. That had to be quite a different experience working in the city, but what you had done on radio for all those years helped you.
It helped me tremendously because I could walk into a city council office and they didn't look at me initially as just being the lobbyist for Mayor Delaney. They saw me as, hey, you're Mike Miller. You were on radio for me. I used to listen to you all the time. Blah, 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 blah. So that was the entree that I was able to use in order to get into the room and begin talking about the agenda that I was really there to talk about on behalf of the mayor.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. You served as president during the 2020 pandemic year, and then you continued the presidency in 2021 because basically, it was a tough time. Talk about that as being president of our group for that time during that period. Kind of frustrating, I guess.
Very frustrating because we all had plans for JBA. JBA was just going through its growth and we were looking for ways to expand and bring more people in. And some people may not realize this, but at one time when I first joined JBA, we were the Jacksonville Retired Broadcasters Association. And it was made up of people, and I was one of the youngest one, and I was over 60 at that time. So we all realized, this is not good for the growth of our organization. We've got to expand and start getting some people who are actually working in the industry to become part of the association. So we dropped the name, we dropped the word retired just to become the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association, and we had this great effort to try to expand and bring people in who are already working at TV and radio stations, and then eventually some print into the organization. Then the pandemic hit and everything just went to hell in a handbasket. No more of the luncheon panel meetings, which I absolutely loved. I thought they were terrific, and I know the audience who showed up for those, who were not all members, but were audience members, loved the people that we've featured on the panels. But all that had to come to an end, and unfortunately, the inertia that we had built up pre-COVID, all of a sudden just fizzled out like every other organization, I'm sure,
in town. Our efforts to have scholarships for communication students, that kind of fell by the way because we just couldn't get together and do anything very
Exactly. Exactly. But I'm hoping all that will go by, and in the next administration of the JBA, hopefully we'll be able to get back to the growth situation, though I still want to be a part of the organization in whatever capacity I'm wanted.
Well, I know you spent 30 years in broadcasting on the radio. You're not doing that anymore, but I see you're still drumming, playing the drums.
Yeah. Now I live in a condo, so I had to get electronic drums so that none of my neighbors would hear me. So I can only hear myself and the music that I'm playing to through a headset.
So you're
but I enjoy it.
You're still ecstatic you went into radio broadcasting, I'm sure.
Yeah, I did. And I still, again, pre-COVID for the most part, but I spend my weekends going out and listening to live music. That's really my favorite thing to do. So I'm going to clubs and bars and everything else. There's a live band. There are a couple of them I follow very, very closely, who also have not been playing much because of COVID. But I try to hook up with live music whenever I can. I love it. And of course, I play drums on my steering wheel all the time.
Well, Mike, thanks for being with us. Your sense of timing in the industry is amazing, because we talk about Disney World and then the Jaguars, and then the Super Bowl here. I mean, your timing is amazing.
It's been a great ride. It really has been a great ride. No regrets whatsoever. I'd do it all over again exactly the same way I did it.
Mike, thanks for joining us today on this oral history for the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.